Foremost, I just want to start this out by thanking everyone who submitted their questions. There was a lot of good questions, and I tried picking the ones that I thought everyone would have a common interest in. I obviously couldn't get everyone's questions in, but if your question wasn't one of the 25 chosen, I'll try to respond to them in the comment section. So Music Life wants to know, how do you feel about the Norteños and Sureños having a peace treaty? And how do you feel about the 50-50 yards? I think anytime the bloodshed stops or ceases, it's always a good thing for the raza. I never thought that this would ever be possible, and I never thought that I'd ever bear witness to what's happening right now. But this generation really is sold on ceasing the war and maintaining peace. I've seen too much bloodshed during the 80s, during the Cork and Shoe Wars, and just throughout the history to ever believe that a truce would be possible. But it's happening right now, and it's real. The younger Norteños and Sureños aren't out there on these main lines conforming and adhering to this truth simply because the NF and the M are promoting it. There's actually real harmony and uniformity taking place out there because they want it. These guys are playing handball together, they're walking the track, socializing, they're playing cards together, and they're out there interacting like there's no division or separation amongst them. I just hope some loose cannon doesn't come along and kick off a war over some type of petty disagreement, because that has the potential to turn into the type of war that I don't think CDCR is ready for. As far as the 50-50 yards, from a political perspective and how it relates to the ABs, the BGF, the MA, and the NF, I think it clearly demonstrates just how much these groups have fallen off and how much they have degenerated within their own system of beliefs and political ideologies. Speaking more specifically about the NF and the MA, these groups are outright compromising some of their own core principles and core beliefs that are written in stone, in the NF's constitution and in the MA's reglas, by loosening its stance and position when it comes to coexisting with dropouts and how they've elected to deal with them. In the beginning, when these yards were first merging, they were hitting these guys that were coming from these S&Y yards, and they refused to allow them to hit the yard. But when CDCR amped things up and changed the way they were merging these yards by increasing the numbers, the NF and the MA changed its position and basically conceded with the merge. I think some of these concessions were accepted because a lot of these guys that had just spent decades in the shoe feared the threat of going back, which is just another compromise in their own belief system. But the icing on the cake came with the implementation of this re-entry or reopen door policy that both the NF and the MA started implementing. They began letting some of these DOs return to the fold if they fell under a certain criteria and if they were willing to pay hefty fines. Drop 5 G's and we'll clear your name and let you come back. I can't believe they actually went that far to turn a profit. And this was being accepted despite the fact that some of these guys had taken part in the debriefing process and had previously walked some of these S&Y yards with pedophiles, degenerates, and rapists. So I think the 50-50 yards exposed a lot about what's going on and how much things are changing. So Marco Gonzalez wants to know, does the NF ever communicate with other Norteños in other states like Washington, Idaho, Oregon, etc., etc.? Yes, the NF does communicate and network with other Norteños that live in other states. The same way the MA has branched out and has metastasized all over the country, the NF has done the same thing. This became more prevalent after Operation Black Widow, as more NF members began getting convicted on federal cases and they started being funneled through the federal prison system. I'm sure there's networking going on with other states and the NF that function in California, but most of this is done through the federal faction as there's separation when it comes to federal and state. I'm sure the federal government doesn't want the credit for enabling the NF to branch out and expand beyond the state of California, but whether they want that credit or not, they're the ones who unknowingly put the NF in the position to do it. So Dynas415 wants to know, since exiting the organization you devoted your life to, who do you now aspire to be? And or what legacy do you want to leave behind? After years of being institutionalized, what was the most challenging part of reacclimating to society and finding a home for yourself, both in the mental and physical senses, especially knowing you're a potential target of others? I just aspire to be me. I have no interest in notoriety or fame. I just want to live a simple life on my terms and my terms alone. Normalcy is what I aspire the most, and this doesn't come easy, especially after years of living my life amongst the criminal element and, of course, after years of long-term incarceration, because it definitely affected me. This is what I refer to in my book as cabin fever, which brings me to the next part of your question. For me, the most challenging part of reacclimating myself back into society was not only the social and economic challenges that I had to go through, but also the anxiety and apprehension I always felt every time I came back home and started interacting with normal people again. I didn't have to worry about waking up and wondering if I was going to have to stab someone today, or I didn't have to worry about the political stratagems that environment forces you to think about every day. Believe it or not, all the little small everyday things that people do or take for granted, like going into a grocery store, going to eat inside of a restaurant, standing in line at a bank, were some of the hardest challenges that I had to reacclimate myself to. Prison left me filled with a lot of anxiety and anger. I had to find ways to temper and modulate these feelings, otherwise I felt like I was out of my element. As far as being a potential target of others, of course, things were different for me when I got out this last time because I was no longer in good standings and I had officially cut those ties that made me a target. But this wasn't something that I allowed to consume me. The most challenging part about that was having to get used to working a legitimate job and not having that fast money at my disposal anymore. Those were my biggest challenges, but I think I had already adjusted to the reality of being a target while I was still in jail, and that I had already come to terms with this before I was released. Enough time had elapsed to where I had basically already accepted it, and there really wasn't much of a transition after getting out. As far as the legacy, the only legacy I want to be remembered for is whatever accomplishments I've been able to achieve since I've been home. I have no desire to look back in the past, and that after all my shortcomings, I was somehow still able to defy the odds and turn my life around for the better, after I wasted 30 years committed to a criminal organization that gave me nothing back. And that through sharing my story, I was somehow able to help some kid, or even a few kids, see that there's no glorification in the gang philosophy. So Speed Kills wants to know, why didn't the NF seem to care about a lot of the Paisa kids starting to claim Sureño hoods, even though they were born and raised in the North and infringing on North territory? Because the NF lost sight of some of its core principles and started focusing more on capital, making money. I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was still a young NR member, one of our primary objectives back then was to not only embrace, protect, defend, and educate Paisas, but to also make sure that they didn't fall victim to the MS propaganda. It was widely known back then that the Sureños were attempting to gain their allegiance for political purposes, and that this was also a fad that was spreading in Northern California. But at some point, we lost sight of this and focused more on generating money. This is around the time when things started falling wayside and the NF ceased caring about the Paisas or how they were embraced as a reflection of our raza. We used to embrace the Paisas, and we used to place a lot of emphasis in preventing them from getting brainwashed by the Sureños because we knew it was a strategy and we knew they were being misled. But then all that stopped. Before this, they either remained neutral or they became allies because they understood that the Norteño cause was not only about the Northern raza, but all raza, and all those that weren't part of the M's agenda. So Valentina Luna wants to know, after defecting, have you found it hard to live a normal life? Have you ever been checked by youngsters because of your tattoos? And have employers ever questioned your integrity because of your appearance? As I alluded to in one of my previous questions, I haven't found it hard to live a normal life so much because of the fact that I defected. I've struggled more with the social and economic challenges, working a legitimate job, being around normal people, getting away from that political mindset that prison fosters, etc., etc. Learning how to act and think like a normal person again without always trying to plot, scam, or manipulate everyone around me. If anything, I think defecting made it a little easier for me to settle into a life of normalcy, because this is something I could never do as long as I was still active. As far as being checked about my tattoos, I don't want this to come across as me sounding arrogant or like I'm trying to be a tough guy, because people will start up that Terminator joke again. But I don't think I look like the kind of guy youngsters are usually too quick to run up on with all that nonsense or jamming me up about my tattoos. I mean, I catch people scoping me out, looking at my tattoos the same way I'm sure they do with everyone else, but I haven't had anyone come up to me and try to check me about my tattoos. If I catch someone looking at me a little longer than I'm usually comfortable with, I'm usually the one who will say something to them first. As far as employers questioning my integrity because of my appearance, that's been the story of my life. I've always had to deal with that, as people, especially prospective employers, tend to stereotype you based on appearance or your dressing habits. That's a stigma that just kind of comes with the way I dress, having a lot of visible tattoos, keeping a bald head, and just other outward mannerisms that lead people to believe that I've been to prison. But the funny thing about this is, if they do decide to give me a chance, they soon come to realize that guys like me end up becoming some of their best and most reliable workers. Because most of the time, guys like me will bring discipline, strong work ethic, punctuality, and other good characteristic traits that we pick up from prison and from living in that type of structured and disciplined environment. So Gonza Spartan 831 wants to know, where does the NF stand as of today? Are they still structured like before? Honestly, I'm not trying to be too critical of the NF, and I'm not grinding no axes. But this is the truth. They've lost a lot of their sway and their swag and their structure. And this comes from the caliber and the type of dudes that they're recruiting right now. When I was recruited within the NF, or even the NR for that matter, it used to be an honor to be recruited, and it came with a deep sense of reverence. It was a privilege, and you had to be cut from a certain cloth in order to get in. Not everyone's cut out for that lifestyle, and a lot of guys who were seeking recruitment weren't even being considered, because back then they got weeded out. You had to be a true believer, not just by word of mouth, but by your actions and by how you conducted yourself as a solid Norteño. And you didn't ask, you were approached based on your individual merits and how well you were progressing. If guys asked if they could take that step, they were told, no, you don't want to ask us, we ask you if we feel you're even worthy enough to make that type of commitment. There used to be strict recruiting and strict screening practices in place back then, but nowadays it just seems like it's taken lightly and almost anyone gets pulled in. So many dudes have either dropped out, walked away, or ended up getting caught up in all the indictments that the recruiting pools are almost dried up. The NF and the NR have become so desperate to replenish their numbers that they're bringing in bottom feeders and mudsuckers now, dudes that never would have been considered back in those days. So although the NF and the NR are still thriving and haven't been completely stumped out because of all those who have either dropped out or got caught up in all these indictments, times have definitely changed, and they don't nearly command the level of fear that they once commanded years ago. So Ariel Duarte wants to know, have you ever covered up any of your tattoos, mainly the NF on the back of your head? Yes, I covered up the tattoo on the back of my head with another tattoo that wraps around both sides of my head. As far as having any of them removed, I had too many tattoos to even consider tattoo removal, so I just covered up all the tattoos that are considered gang related. As a matter of fact, I have more tattoos now than I did before, as I have my back, chest, and neck completely covered. So Frankie Perry wants to know, do any of those guys ever try to reach out for not giving me the benefit of the doubt when I was trying to prove my loyalty, and how was the change for me? No, unfortunately, Frankie, nobody reached out and sent me any apology letters. To just keep it completely real with you, nobody cares about what happened to me, and it's not like there's anyone who feels guilty for wronging me. It's sad, but I'm a realist, and I'm not in denial about it, allowing myself to think that I was just some big important figure that everyone's going to miss, and how the organization is now going to try to find a way to recover without me. I'm expendable just like anyone else, and that's just the way it is. The NF didn't care about my dying wife. It's insensitive to things like this, and this is something I knew, but that didn't mean I was going to stop caring for her. The closest anyone's come to acknowledging that I got a raw deal and that Lencho sabotaged the investigation involving my situation was after I got released and I ran into a couple dudes that were still active and who remembered me from the county jail. And it was just in the course of conversation that it was said, but even in situations like this, it's understood that all this happened that was pretty much above their heads and that this was basically NF business. So Ivan Tavares wants to know, when the GUN album was released, how much of an influence did the NF have in Darkroom Familia Records and Sir Dino? How did these albums impact the prison yards? The NF promoted this album, and it was done under design. Robert Huerito Grattan from Modesto was the NF's vehicle that orchestrated these ventures, and he was basically tasked with overseeing the whole project. A lot of young norteños who were aspiring to get into the rap industry began showcasing their talent, and Darkroom Familia kind of became the mecca or the epicenter that these rappers flocked to. Huerito basically put his foot in the door and used the NF's influence to assert control over Darkroom Familia. Once that control was firmly established, the NF basically bullied its way in and started dictating Sir Dino and his crew. Prior to this, their music wasn't norteño based, if you remember. They used to talk about flagging brown bandanas, and their music had a neutral feel about it. But once the NF asserted full control and started bringing in its own hardcore norteño rappers, the label morphed into an exclusive norteño dominated label that promoted NR and NF connotations. This is when the GUN album began to develop. One of the interim generals at the time, Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba, had a vision and used this as an opportunity to effectuate it. He drafted up a mandate that was known as El Norte Law, and this was basically an advisement that had several purposes: to stop the red-on-red bloodshed, to incite the norteño street gang members to start cleaning up what was being referred to as the infestation of sureños on the streets of Northern California, and to basically unite and bring all the norteños back in line and under full control of the NF. And it worked. It instantly caused a huge spike in gang-related murders on the streets, and the red-on-red conflict stopped, or they scaled back. I don't know that it had much of an effect on the prison yards, as you asked in the second part of your question, but if it did, it was along the lines of causing bad blood and animosity. So George Duarte wants to know, what is my relationship with Jesus Christ? I'm not going to lie, my religious beliefs are almost non-existent. However, I do believe in a higher power. I'm not a non-believer and my mind is open, but during some of the most difficult times that I suffered some of my hardships and some of my personal losses, it just seems like it was always at times like these that I had my faith shaken. The loss of my wife Vicky, my mom, and my grandmother just came at a time that was almost inconceivable to accept. I almost felt like I was being punished. I did get on my knees and I did reach out to a God, if there is one, but it wasn't to pray to him. It was to ask him how he could ever expect me to put faith in someone like him when he took the only 3 people in this world that meant something to me at a time when I was already at one of my lowest points. I just couldn't understand how innocent babies and how the good people in life who are completely undeserving always seem to suffer or die prematurely, when the bad people in life go on to live long, prosperous, healthy lives. I know they say everything happens for a reason, but for me, this shook my faith, and I just couldn't bring myself to understand it. So San Jose's Finest wants to know, do you miss anything or ever think about the life and wish you could go back? I'm going to be honest. If there's one thing I can say that I truly missed about that lifestyle, it would be the camaraderie. The carnalismo and the brotherism that I remember feeling back in the late 80s, early 90s. This was when we were at our strongest and the norteño spirit was burning strong, both on the streets and in prison. That's probably the one thing I miss the most. I met some solid homeboys over the years and embraced some of them like real brothers. When you're around stand-up people who you know got your back and who will ride with you no matter what you're up against, that's empowering and you feel a strong bond similar to what you feel when you're around family. I try not to let my thoughts become overrun with thoughts of my past because there's a lot more to life to look forward to now. But it's hard when you live like this for so many years and when it was all you knew. The one thing I don't miss is the politics. The politics have turned cutthroat, dog eat dog, and that's just not the way it's supposed to be. Instead of trying to pull someone out of the water when you see them drowning, these guys will try to find ways to make you sink faster. Some of these guys get a rise or some type of kick, self-kick, from seeing the next man fail or for seeing him fall in bad standings. Instead of throwing him a lifeline and trying to help him get his feet back on solid ground, they'd rather see him drown and sink to the bottom. When you have to send your personal mail to your tier security so he can read it first because there is no more trust amongst each other as brothers. When your fellow carnales are plotting and scamming different ways to kill each other over money, control, and position, or when it no longer seems to concern or surprise anyone when a fellow norteño lays it down or walks away on a daily basis, or when the upper echelon and the leadership no longer values the core principles in which the whole movement was founded on, you know things have gotten bad and that the organization has reached a critical point in time. So Speed Kills wants to know, did any of the NF or NR members that dropped out join the Northern Riders? Almost all Northern Riders were former NR or NF members. In my opinion, NR members are more prone to become Northern Riders because most NF members share the same mindset with regards to joining the dropout clique. It's just not something that they believe in, and in some aspects, it's almost like going from the big leagues back to the minors, or getting demoted, going from a leadership position to the bottom of the pecking order. From my experience, most NF members that drop out end up just sticking to themselves. I heard that some of the older dudes at one time started joining the Nueva Flores when they first evolved, but that clique is almost non-existent today. So Joshua Ojeda wants to know, would you become friends with the Sureño, or does the opposition mentality still linger inside you? What mentality do you have now that you are no longer with the organization? I have friends that are Sureños, and it's not something that I put a whole lot of emphasis on anymore. I don't care where your loyalties lie. If you conduct yourself with the measure of respect and you don't act like an idiot, that's all that really matters to me. I've worked with Sureños at some of my past places of employment, and I still communicate with some to this day. But let me make this clear. The individuals I associate with aren't out there on the streets gang banging wearing jerseys with big 13s on them. These are older guys that have grown out of all that. They still have their southern roots, and every now and then we'll joke about things that have norteño or sureño connotations connected to them. But that's as far as it goes. The opposition mentality you spoke of only surfaces if I see that gangbanging drama in the streets, or if I catch someone trying to play that crap with me. As to the last part of your question, now that I have separated myself from the organization, my mentality isn't dictated by those politics anymore, and I've just tried to maintain a more positive outlook. I try not to allow myself to fall back on some of the old habits that the NF mentality fostered, like how you gain more respect in that lifestyle, how I was always trying to manipulate or deceive people, etc., etc. Now my mentality is geared more toward how can I better myself, how can I prosper, how can I be more successful in some of my personal endeavors and things like that. So FKED Gamer wants to know, what can we do as a society to help prevent children or future generations from following in your footsteps and joining a gang? Is there anything that would have stopped you from going down that path? That's a good question, and it's one that I've often been asked. Sometimes kids can be real difficult to get through. We've all been there, and I'm sure we all remember how we used to be ourselves. These youngsters all think that they've got it all figured out, that they're smarter than the rest of us, and that they won't fall victim to the same kinds of mistakes. You've got to really make a full-time commitment out of mentoring one of these kids, and you've almost got to walk beside them to make sure that they're getting it. Unfortunately, in my opinion, I think that once they've been exposed to the streets, if you don't get them before they turn 12, it's almost going to be like fighting an uphill battle. I know because it happened to me. I had people who were really trying to help me, but the streets were just pulling back too hard. By then, I was already drowning and had to learn for myself. As to the last part of your question, maybe if someone would have got to me a lot sooner when I was younger, and they would have taken me out of that environment I was running around in, I might have went down a different path and I might have looked at things differently. But as a society, we've got to give them better opportunities. Not only employment, but if they want to be rappers, take them to a studio. If they want to be professional athletes, then get them enrolled in some of these sports programs and help walk them through it. We've got to help find them ways to entertain all that idle time, as this is where they get in trouble. It might not seem like it doesn't help, but I can't emphasize enough how they need to keep being reminded of how the streets and that lifestyle will destroy all their dreams. Hearing about other people's shortcomings and how it's destroyed their lives, and arming them with that information really does help. Because despite that hard exterior image that a lot of them try to outwardly portray, trust me, they listen and it helps. So Jesus Ayo wants to know, has the thought of leaving the witness protection program ever crossed your mind? Well, if I ever would have been in the witness protection program, I probably would have hit the burners a long time ago. I don't know where this assumption came from, because I never alluded to being in the witness protection program in my book. But maybe Jesus Ayo just assumed that this came with the territory. But this is still a good question, because the feds did give me the option to enter into that program if I wanted to. But I ultimately chose not to. Not just because of all the negative and dramatic things that I've heard about it, but also because I had just spent close to 10 years in the county jail, and I just didn't want to go back to another structured environment like that. But what I did do is I opted to take advantage of the district attorney's relocation program. It's nothing like the witness protection program. All it consists of is you being relocated to a county of your choosing. They put you up in a hotel like an extended stay. They pay your rent for up to a year. They give you a monthly per diem, a check for food, and you're just required to stay out of the county where you were convicted in. There's some other small rules and policies, but it's nothing like the other program. So Chris P wants to know, have you ever interacted with bonafide MA members during the years in prison, fighting, talking, etc., etc.? Of course. In fact, I probably interacted with more MA members than I did Sureños, because most of the time I spent in prison was in the SHU program, and this is where they were all at. I met a lot of MA members in Corcoran SHU and in San Quentin's Adjustment Center as well. The Adjustment Center, or the AC, was 90% condemned. And for death row, the AC was like the SHU for the validated MA, NF, BGF, and the ABs. I could name about 50 MA members that I met over the years, but I crossed paths with the majority of them in Pelican Bay. A lot of this interaction was strictly for social purposes, but some of it was also by design. Just as I'm sure the MA keeps tabs on the NF and who its members are, we did the same. It was not only my business to know who they were, but it was also my responsibility. And it was always common practice for us to maintain open lines of communication with the MA, so that we could not only resolve minor issues that might come up, but just to also maintain this communication for information purposes. So PNG News Media wants to know, what percentage of NF would you consider, or what percentage of NF would you say gets murdered, dies in prison, drops out, or gets to retire? This is probably the easiest question I've been asked. 100%. This is actually an advisement that you're given during your induction ceremony. My mentor, MC, told me straight up, this life ain't for everyone. It's a hard life, and this is the beginning of an ultimate sacrifice, you making this commitment. He told me, you're either going to spend the rest of your life in prison, you're going to die carrying out the will of the organization, or you're going to walk away from this organization dishonorably. Those were the three paths he told me that were already laid out for me. He didn't candy coat nothing, and he even said, if you're wondering why freedom isn't one of those paths, let's face it. Nobody lasts forever out there on them streets anymore. Sooner or later, you're either going to make a mistake or someone's going to tell on you. But if I was going to break your question down by percentage, I'd say 30% gets murdered, 20% die in prison, 49% drop out, and 1% retires. That's just my opinion though. So, Raider Nation wants to know, how much do you still hate Sureños? I didn't know I did. Not at all. I grew out of that gangbang mentality in my 20s, and prison is actually what changed my whole perception of Sureños. Of course, they were the opposition, and during the earlier years after I started going to prison prior to getting validated, I had my share of personal conflicts with them. I was in melees with them, I was involved in that group stabbing that got me validated, and there were a lot of other incidents. But after spending almost 20 years in the SHU programs and being in close proximity with them, I learned how to respect people according to how they carried themselves, including sureños. For that matter, I met other norteños I didn't care about based on how they conducted themselves and just by the way that they acted. I met and ran across some good solid sureños in the SHU programs, and even though we technically were at war at the time, we coexisted and interacted back there. It was all about mutual and common respect, sharing literature, reading material, or engaging in dialogue about world politics, history, or other areas of interest was common practice back there. If they needed hygiene, coffee, a couple soups, or some writing material, then we'd offer these things up to each other. These are just materialistic things that I personally used to place little emphasis on. But offering some of these things up to someone who doesn't have nothing serves a bigger purpose, and this gesture was always reciprocated. So Airman Espinoza wants to know, what was the common trait, good and bad, you've seen in all C's? The common trait that I seen in all C's was that they all carried themselves with an air of confidence, and they all demonstrated leadership abilities. This was something that I admired, and it was these types of characteristic traits that I wanted to develop myself. The NF members today are a whole different pedigree from the type of C's I remember meeting when I was still a young NR member. They were well-spoken, educated, they conducted themselves like professionals, they exuberated confidence, and they led by example. Those were the common good traits that most C's possessed, and this is what I tried to emulate. On the other hand, some of the bad common traits that I noticed that a lot of C's also developed was to become self-absorbed, egotistical, and a lot of them didn't know how to will power. Their status would get to their heads, and some of these C's just didn't know how to manage the power or effectuate good leadership. This is why there's so much corruption within the organization right now. So Debo wants to know, if you could do it all over but stayed in good standings with the NF, would you? Honest answer, I'm conflicted. The guy who's been humbled by this whole experience and who learned some valuable lessons from it would say no. I wouldn't do it all over again. Because although I could change some of my missteps, it's obvious that the NF would continue its normal practice of following some of the fundamental principles it claims to live by, and that its concept of expendability has become a major discouragement to even some of the long-term members. On the other hand, the alter ego boxer would say yes, I would do it all over again. Because after investing almost 30 years to this organization, it's almost inconceivable to accept the fact that it was all for nothing. I ended up losing more than I gained, and even though remaining in good standing would obviously come with a 155-year life sentence, I would have just preferred to maintain my position since this was something I committed myself to. Because if I'm going to keep it all the way real, guys like me who defect from these types of criminal organizations, can try to justify their shortcomings by claiming the victim and by blaming everyone else for their failures. But the bottom line is that nobody wants to be in bad standings or accept the fact that their name is now dishonored. So Freddie Burgos wants to know, how much time did you end up serving after your cooperation? I know I detailed this in the last few chapters of my book, but let me cover this again since this seems to be a question that keeps coming up. I stayed in the Santa Clara County Jail a couple months shy of 9 years. I was arrested in 2004, and I was officially released after my sentencing in the latter part of 2012. Like I mentioned several times throughout the book, I had no idea how much time I was going to be sentenced to once these cases were adjudicated, and I basically had to throw myself at the mercy of the court. I had to plead guilty to all my charges and hope that the judge would agree with the DA's recommendation. So for about 10 minutes, prior to the judge striking some of my priors and my enhancements, I was actually sentenced to 155 years to life. In the end, the judge sentenced me to 16 years and 4 months, which was basically enough to credit me out. So no name 777 wants to know, how is life for you today? Do you ever find yourself wanting to go back in the streets after a lifetime of operating that way? Or are you dead set on moving forward and not looking back? I'm going to be honest, sometimes I do find myself thinking about hitting the streets and resorting back to some of my old ways. I've never claimed to be fully rehabilitated or that I was completely changed man. If I claim this, it would be a bold-faced lie. You can't purge or extract 30 years of criminal behavior or criminal habits overnight. It just don't work like this. Sometimes I struggle financially and money doesn't come as fast as I was accustomed to. It's been at times like this that my resolve was tested and I was forced to shake myself out of it. Although those thoughts have occasionally crept in, I've been through enough to come to the realization that I'd rather go through the everyday struggles that everybody else out here goes through in life, opposed to having to go back to prison and being subjected to the type of struggles that go on in there behind the walls. Trust me, there is no comparison, and I'd rather keep my freedom under any circumstances. You asked how life is for me today. It's been what I've made of it. I have my share of good days and bad days, but for the most part, I've settled into somewhat of a life of normalcy. I work, I go to the gym, I invest more of myself into my personal relationships. I spend every day trying to be better than I was the day before. But most of all, I don't look back and I don't allow myself to be consumed with what I had to go through or what it took for me to get to where I am now. So Devontrays Haynes wants to know, if you had the opportunity, would you have joined the NF if you knew your future? This is too easy of a question to answer. It's almost like asking me if I had a crystal ball and could somehow foresee the dilemmas I would later go through in the future. Would I still elect to take the same path? Absolutely not. It would be foolish of me to answer this any other way. If I had the ability to see just a fraction of the dilemmas and bad experiences that I'd been through throughout the years, I would have turned the other way and I would have ran as fast as I could. And that's not too fast. I wasted almost 30 years of my criminal life wallowing in that criminal cesspool, and now I don't have nothing to show for it. Just lost time, broken relationships, bad choices, missed opportunities, and time that I'll never be able to get back. I have nobody but myself to blame for making that commitment, and I own it. But if I could do it all over again, no, I wouldn't have joined the NF. So Vinny David Valentine wants to know, if someone is a dropout, are they looked at the same way as if they were to have debriefed? This all depends on who you ask and what their position is. From a perspective of someone who's active, it's neither here nor there. Because at the end of the day, if you're no longer in good standings, you're considered to be trash or degenerate, period. There is no distinction. If you go into a household or an NF establishment, i.e. a county jail or a prison, and you're identified as being on that list, that's all that matters. It's not like you get any special consideration for only being a dropout, a kick out, a beat out, a stab out, or a walkout. You're considered to be trash, and you got the same thing coming as anyone else in bad standings. I think the only ones who try to make this distinction are the dropouts themselves, or civilians when trying to create some type of separation. Something that's become inherently clear to me since I defected is that there is a lot of dropouts that seem to think they're a cut above the rest that haven't snitched or debriefed. Almost as if they're more noble and have more integrity than some of these other guys who have done it. This is nonsense, because on one hand, they'll try to save face by making this assertion and then turn right around and walk a yard with pedophiles and rapists. How can you condemn someone else for what they did when you've compromised your integrity yourself? The other thing I can't understand is how someone who is debriefed can criticize someone who testified in court. Snitching is snitching no matter how you slice it and dice it. What's the difference from giving up information on your former prison gang so that you can get your mainline status back? It's all telling. But most of these guys that went through that process will lie about it and claim that they didn't do it. I guess they expect everyone to believe that the SSU just felt sorry for them and decided to let them go out to an SNY because they just didn't have nothing to offer. So the last question, CG wants to know, could you elaborate more on the time you had to go through withdrawals from heroin in jail? You couldn't get any, and your boy, Pony, you called couldn't get any to you. How did you get through being sick in jail while still maintaining a high-ranking position? That part of the story seemed to be glossed over. Trust me, it wasn't glossed over. I just don't think you understood. What you need to understand is that I didn't just go straight into the jail and assume the overall position as soon as I got there. If you go back to that part of the book, I was initially put in an observation cell for the first 3 weeks after I got there. It was during these 3 weeks in that observation cell that I went through the worst part of the withdrawals. And it was during these 3 weeks that those critical phone calls were made. Trust me, I was laid flat out on my back and suffered the worst type of withdrawals that I've ever experienced during the entire time that I had ever struggled with that garbage. Like I said later in the book, the withdrawals were so bad that it became part of a deterrent of why I would never want to touch that stuff again. But just for the sake of clarification, you are correct. I don't think I would have been physically or mentally capable or would have ever had the interest of maintaining that position if it would have been delegated to me as soon as I got there. I didn't officially assume that position until about 4 weeks later after I was moved to Area 51 with some of my other co-defendants. Again, I appreciate all the questions, and for those of you that didn't get your questions answered, I'll try to answer them in the comment section.